January 15th, 1994. The Atlantic Ocean, off the Canary Islands. The ocean was not just angry that night. It was murderous. A force 11 gale was hammering the eastern Atlantic, whipping the sea into a frenzy that seasoned sailors describe as a confused state. The waves were not rhythmic rollers, but mountainous, chaotic hills of black water 40 feet high, capped with foaming white crests that were torn apart by the wind before they could even break. The sky was a bruised purple, merging with the sea in a curtain of driving rain and salt spray that reduced visibility to near zero. In the middle of this elemental chaos, two ships were locked in a desperate, silent struggle against physics. The first was the Neftega 67, a rugged Ukrainian ocean-going tug built for exactly this kind of punishment. She was burying her nose deep into the troughs, taking green water over her bridge, her engines screaming at full power as she churned the water white, trying to maintain headway against the wall of wind. But the tug wasn't the problem. The problem was the ghost she was dragging behind her. Trailing 1,000 feet astern, connected by a single thick steel cable, was the SS American Star. To the casual observer, seeing her silhouette illuminated by the jagged flashes of lightning, she looked majestic. She still possessed the classic, elegant lines of a 1940s ocean liner, the raked bow, the tiered decks, the two massive funnels that once signaled speed and power to the world. She was huge, over 700 feet long, a floating city of steel that dwarfed the tug pulling her. But she was dead. There were no lights in her portholes. There was no smoke rising from her stacks. Her engines were cold and silent, rested solid after years of neglect. Her rudder was locked amidships. She had no radar, no radio, and no power. She was just a massive, hollow steel shell, helpless against the violence of the storm, being towed from Greece to Thailand to be converted into a floating 5-star hotel. It was supposed to be her final dignity, a retirement in the sun after a lifetime of service. Instead, she was being dragged through hell. On the bridge of the Neftega 67, the captain was fighting a losing battle. The American Star was not behaving. Without power or steering, she was yawing, wildly swinging from side to side like a giant pendulum behind the tug. Every time she swung out to the beam, she jerked the tow line violently, sending a shudder through both vessels. That tow line was the ship's only lifeline. It was a massive braided steel cable, thick as a man's arm, designed to pull oil rigs across oceans. It was rated for hundreds of tons of tension. It was supposed to be unbreakable. But the ocean does not care about engineering specifications. The wind gusted to 60 knots just as the American Star rode up the face of a massive rogue wave. Gravity took over. The liner slid down the back of the wave, picking up speed, surfing into the trough with terrifying momentum. At the exact same moment, the tug was climbing the face of the next wave, pulling forward. The two ships moved in opposite directions with thousands of tons of kinetic energy. The slack in the cable vanished in a millisecond. The sound was louder than the thunder. It was a sharp, metallic whip crack that vibrated through the hull of the tug like a collision. On the aft deck of the Neftega 67, the broken end of the cable whipped back with lethal force, lashing against the winch and destroying the safety railings. The captain looked aft, his heart sinking. Through the driving rain, he saw the frayed end of the line trailing uselessly in the boiling water. And in the distance, disappearing into the mist and the spray, he saw the dark shape of the American Star. She was free. But in a storm like this, freedom is a death sentence. A ship without engines in a gale instantly turns broadside to the waves. She becomes a wall. The wind pushes her, and the current takes her. The American Star was now drifting helpless, entirely at the mercy of the Atlantic. And she wasn't drifting out to sea. She was drifting east, directly toward the jagged volcanic coast of the island of Fuerteventura. On board the dead liner, the terror was absolute. The ship wasn't empty. There was a riding crew. On board a small team of 4 men whose job was to check the lines and ensure the ship didn't flood during the voyage. They had been living in the emergency generator room, huddled under battery-powered lights, listening to the ship groan around them. When the line snapped, the motion of the ship changed instantly. She stopped plowing through the waves and started rolling. Deep, sickening rolls that threw the men across the room and sent equipment crashing to the deck. The ancient hull plates screamed as they twisted in the swell. They scrambled to the bridge, climbing up the darkened stairwells of the once luxurious liner, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. They looked out of the salt-encrusted windows and saw nothing but black water and white foam. They fired emergency red flares into the night sky, vibrant streaks of light begging the tug to come back, but the Neftegas 67 couldn't get close. The waves were too high. To attempt a reconnection in this sea state would be suicide. The liner's massive hull would crush the smaller tug like an eggshell. The radio crackled, the tug captain's voice barely audible over the static, delivering the news that no sailor ever wants to hear. Line broken. Cannot reconnect. You are drifting. Prepare for grounding. This was the end of the line for one of the most famous ships ever built. She had been launched by a first lady. She had carried spies and soldiers in World War II. She had carried immigrants to Australia and movie stars to Europe. She was a symbol of American industrial might, a queen of the oceans. And now she was hours away from being smashed to pieces on a lonely Spanish beach because of a single snapped wire. How did the pride of the United States Merchant Marine end up as a rusting hulk on a surfer's beach in the Canary Islands? And why did her destruction become one of the most haunting spectacles of the modern age? If you want to know the story of the ghost ship that refused to disappear, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You are about to witness the slow, agonizing death of the SS American Star. To understand the magnitude of the tragedy playing out in the dark waters of the Canary Islands in 1994, one must look away from the rusting, empty hull and travel back 55 years, to a time when that same steel was polished to a mirror finish, and the only thing crashing against the bow was champagne. The ship that was fighting for her life in the gale was not always a ghost. She was once the physical embodiment of a nation's ambition, a floating palace designed to tell the world that the United States had finally arrived as a maritime superpower. She was the SS America, and her story began on a humid summer morning in Newport News, Virginia, on August 31st, 1939. The scene at the shipyard was a spectacle of patriotism and hope that stands in stark, heartbreaking contrast to the lonely death she would eventually suffer. Over 30,000 people had gathered on the banks of the James River, waving flags and sweating in their Sunday best, their eyes fixed on the massive black hull towering above them. The air was filled with the brassy notes of a military band and the roar of anticipation, because this wasn't just a ship launch. It was a coronation. Standing on the christening platform, holding a bottle of American sparkling wine rather than French champagne, was the First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. When she swung the bottle against the steel bow and declared, "I christen thee, America," the crowd erupted. The massive ship slid down the grease-slicked ways and hit the water with a majestic splash that sent a wave of pride through a country still shaking off the dust of the Great Depression. The America was the answer to the great European liners, the Queen Mary, the Normandy, the Bremen. She was slightly smaller than the European giants, but she was widely considered to be the most perfectly proportioned ship ever built. She was designed by the legendary naval architect William Francis Gibbs, a man obsessed with safety and speed, who gave her a sleek, raked bow and 2 monumental funnels painted in red, white, and blue that made her look like she was doing 30 knots, even when she was tied to the pier. The interior of the SS America was a masterpiece of Art Deco design, a deliberate rejection of the stuffy, wood-paneled drawing rooms of the British liners. Instead of trying to look like an English manor house, the America looked like a Manhattan jazz club. Her ballrooms were clad in stainless steel, aluminum, and rare veneers. Her dining salons featured towering lucite sculptures and murals celebrating the American landscape. She was modern, she was democratic, and she was breathtakingly beautiful. She was designed to carry the elite of Hollywood, the captains of industry, and the diplomats of the world in a level of comfort that was unrivaled. But there was a dark irony to her birth that would haunt her forever. The America was launched on August 31st, 1939. Less than 24 hours later, on September 1st, Hitler's tanks rolled across the border into Poland. The ship that had been christened as a symbol of peace and travel was born on the exact day the world caught fire. Because of the Neutrality Acts, the America never got to sail the transatlantic route she was built for. Instead of carrying tourists to Paris and London, she spent her first years cruising nervously in the Caribbean, painted with giant American flags on her sides and floodlit at night to prevent German U-boats from torpedoing her by mistake. The passengers drank cocktails and danced in the ballroom. But there was a tension in the air, a sense that the party was happening on the edge of a volcano. And when Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, the party ended abruptly. The America was drafted. She was stripped of her luxury. The Art Deco murals were covered with plywood. The lucite sculptures were crated and stored. The luxurious staterooms, designed for couples, were gutted and fitted with tiered bunk beds stacked 4 high. Her beautiful red, white, and blue funnels were painted a dreary, tactical gray. She lost her name and became the USS West Point, AP-23, a troop transport dedicated to hauling the youth of America into the meat grinder of the global war. For the next 4 years, the Queen of the Merchant Marine became a workhorse. She carried nearly 500,000 soldiers across the most dangerous oceans on Earth. She sailed without escorts, relying on her high speed to outrun the U-boat Wolf packs. She was attacked by Japanese bombers in Singapore. She evacuated refugees from Bombay. She carried spies, generals, and terrified infantrymen. The smell of expensive perfume in her corridors was replaced by the smell of diesel, sweat, and fear. She was a ghost ship even then, a gray phantom slipping through the fog, hunted by the enemy, her survival dependent on the skill of her crew and the speed of her engines. When the war ended, she survived when so many others didn't. She was returned to the United States lines, her gray paint chipped and her interiors worn, but her spirit unbroken. She underwent a massive refit to restore her glory. The bunk beds were removed, the murals were uncovered, and the champagne began to flow once again. For the next 15 years, the SS America enjoyed her golden age. She finally became what she was meant to be, the favorite way to cross the Atlantic. Throughout the 1950s, she was the darling of the seas. If you were a movie star traveling to a premiere in London, or a diplomat heading to the UN, you took the America. She was comfortable, reliable, and beloved by her crews. She was the friendly ship, less stiff and formal than her faster, bigger running mate, the SS United States. While the United States was the Greyhound obsessed with speed records, the America was the hostess obsessed with comfort. She sailed through the storms of the North Atlantic with a gentle, kindly motion that passengers loved. But time is the one enemy that no ship can outrun. By the mid-1960s, the world was changing. The jet engine had arrived. The Boeing 707 could cross the ocean in 6 hours, making the 5-day voyage of the America seem impossibly slow. The era of the ocean liner was dying. In 1964, the United States lines, facing mounting costs and dwindling passenger lists, made the heartbreaking decision to sell her. This was the beginning of her long, slow slide into indignity. She was sold to a Greek shipping company, Chandris Lines, and renamed the SS Australis. They painted her white, ripped out some of her cargo holds to cram in more cabins, and turned her into an immigrant ship. For another decade, she carried thousands of people from Europe to a new life in Australia and New Zealand. She was still a hard-working ship, but the glamour was fading. The Art Deco elegance was being covered by cheap 1970s refits. The maintenance schedules were stretched. The engines were getting tired. By the late 1970s, she was sold again and again. She became the Italis, then the Noga, then the Alfredos. With each sail, her name changed and her condition worsened. She spent years rotting at anchor in the Lucis Bay in Greece, her hull rusting, her pipes leaking, waiting for a savior that never came. She became a pawn in bankruptcy courts, a liability on a balance sheet. The once proud queen of the American fleet was reduced to a derelict, inhabited only by rats and the ghosts of the millions of people she had carried. Then, in 1993, a miracle seemed to happen. A group of investors in Thailand bought her. They had a vision. They would tow her to Phuket, restore her, and turn her into a spectacular floating hotel. It was a lifeline. It was a chance for the old girl to have one last act of glory. She was pulled out of the mud, dry-docked, and prepared for the long tow halfway around the world. Her propellers were removed and strapped to her deck to reduce drag. Her name was changed one last time to the American Star. But as she left Greece behind the tug Neftegas 67, she wasn't the ship she used to be. She was tired. Her steel was brittle. Her soul seemed heavy. And as she entered the Atlantic Ocean in January 1994, heading into the teeth of a winter gale, she wasn't a queen anymore. She was a victim waiting for the executioner. A tow line that connected her to the future was about to become the noose that condemned her to the past. January 17, 1994, the coast of Fuerteventura. For 2 agonizing days, the SS American Star was a prisoner of the gale, a 10,000-ton steel leaf blown across the surface of the Atlantic. After the tow line had parted in the fury of the storm, the tug Neftegas 67 had remained close, circling frantically like a sheepdog trying to corral a lost member of the flock. The tug captain fought the controls, diving into the deep troughs and climbing the mountainous swells, desperately looking for a window of calm to shoot a new line across to the drifting liner. But the ocean refused to offer even a moment of mercy. The waves remained high and chaotic. The wind kept screaming at force 10, and the heavy steel hull of the liner acted like a massive sail, catching the full force of the gale and pushing the vessel relentlessly eastward. The 4 men of the riding crew trapped on board the American Star were living a slow-motion nightmare. Without power, they had no way to steer, no way to drop the heavy anchors that might have held them fast, and no way to fight the current. They could feel the motion of the ship changing beneath their feet. In the deep ocean, she rolled with a long, sickening rhythm, heaving slowly over the swells. But as the hours ticked by and the water grew shallower, the rhythm became sharper and more violent. The waves were beginning to feel the bottom, standing up taller and crashing with increasing force against the rusting steel plates, signaling that the end of the journey was near. On the morning of January 18th, the sun rose over a scene of terrifying beauty. The storm had not broken, but the visibility had improved enough to reveal the final destination of their voyage. It was not the tropical paradise of Thailand, with its warm waters and waiting dry docks. Instead, looming out of the mist and driving spray, was a desolate moonscape of black volcanic rock and yellow sand known as Playa de Garcey. Fuerteventura is an island forged by fire, and its western coast is a graveyard for ships where the Atlantic Ocean rolls uninterrupted for 3,000 miles before smashing into the cliffs with the accumulated energy of the entire crossing. Squarely in the path of this geological hammer stood the helpless American Star. At 6:15 a.m., the inevitable finally happened. The ship did not run aground gently. She did not slide onto a soft sandbank to wait for the tide. She was picked up by a massive roller, lifted bodily toward the shore, and dropped onto the jagged rock shelf that lay just beneath the surf. The impact was apocalyptic, a collision of 20,000 tons of steel meeting immovable volcanic stone that tore through the double bottom of the hull and shattered the silence of the abandoned dining rooms. The collision ripped open the fuel tanks, bleeding the last dregs of heavy oil into the pristine water, and threw the crew on the bridge to the deck as the ship came to a violent, grinding halt. The liner had landed broadside to the beach, the worst possible orientation for a stranded vessel. If she had gone in bow first, she might have cut through the surf and survived relatively intact. But broadside, she became a dam, blocking the entire energy of the Atlantic Ocean. The waves, traveling at 40 miles an hour, slammed into the starboard side of the liner with thousands of tons of pressure, pushing the ship harder onto the rocks and grinding the keel against the stone like a file against soft iron. The ship groaned in protest, the rivets popping and the internal bulkheads buckling under the assault. High above the wreck, the rotors of a Spanish Air Force Super Puma helicopter beat against the gale, answering the distress calls from the drifting ship. The rescue team looked down at the scene with disbelief, seeing a skyscraper lying on its side in the surf, being swallowed by white foam. The pilot fought the wind shear coming off the cliffs, hovering over the stern of the liner with the basket swinging wildly in the turbulence. One by one, the 4 members of the riding crew were hoisted from the deck, leaving behind their personal effects, their tools, and the ship they had tried to save. As the helicopter banked away toward the safety of the airfield, the men looked back to see the American Star alone on the beach, the waves crashing over her promenade deck and the spray flying as high as the smokestacks. The ship looked trapped and defeated, but the real violence was just beginning. A ship is designed to be supported by water, the pressure of the ocean pushing up against the hull evenly along its entire length to counteract gravity. But when a ship runs aground on an uneven rock shelf, that support vanishes. The American Star was resting on a pinnacle of rock near the stern and another shelf near the bow. But her midsection, the area just after the second funnel, was hanging over a deep depression in the reef. She was a bridge with no middle pillar. As the tide dropped, the water rushed out from under her, and gravity pulled the unsupported middle section down, a force naval architects call sagging. Then, as the tide rose, the waves smashed into the side of the hull, lifting the ship up and dropping her back down in a cycle of torture. The steel of the hull, already brittle from 50 years of service and neglect, began to fatigue rapidly. Microscopic cracks appeared in the sheer strake, the same kind of stress fractures that had doomed the Schenectady decades earlier, but here the force wasn't thermal. It was brutal, kinetic repetition. The ship was being bent back and forth until the structural integrity of the keel failed completely. It took less than 48 hours for the ocean to finish the job. On January 20th, just 2 days after the grounding, the American Star gave up. It happened during high tide when a massive set of waves rolled in from the open ocean. The first wave lifted the bow, the second wave lifted the stern, and the middle section, filled with the heavy machinery of the engine room, stayed down. The sound of the failure was a sharp, thunderous report that cut through the noise of the surf as a tear appeared on the port side, just behind the second funnel. It was a laceration that ran from the waterline up to the promenade deck in seconds, shearing the steel plates, splintering the teak decks, and severing the piping, wiring, and ventilation ducts that connected the front of the ship to the back. The ship broke cleanly in two. The stern section, housing the propellers and the aft dining room, rolled slightly to port, while the bow section, housing the bridge and the officers' quarters, remained upright. The SS American Star was no longer a ship. She was two separate islands of scrap metal, separated by a widening gap of churning white water. The ocean rushed into the breach, tearing at the soft interiors and flushing out furniture, mattresses, and fittings. The Queen was dead, executed by the sea, but strangely, this was not the end of her story. She did not sink immediately, but sat there on the beach, broken but visible, towering over the coastline like a surreal monument to failure that would soon draw looters and adventurers from around the world. Late January 1994, Playa de Garcey, Fuerteventura. The death of an ocean liner is usually a private affair, hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water in the cold silence of the abyss. The Titanic lies in eternal darkness. The Andrea Doria rests in the murky twilight of the Atlantic shelf. But the death of the SS American Star was public, visceral, and agonizingly slow. She did not disappear into the deep. She sat stubborn and broken in the surf zone, transforming the lonely beach of Playa de Garcey into a stage for a surreal drama that would last for more than a decade. In the days immediately following the breakup, the violence of the Atlantic focused its rage on the stern section. This back half of the ship, which contained the heavy propellers and the aft dining salon, had no defenses. It rolled helplessly in the surf, battered by the ceaseless hammering of the waves against the jagged rocks. Within weeks, the structural integrity failed completely. The steel twisted and collapsed upon itself, and the stern simply disintegrated, swallowed by the ocean, until only scattered ribs and plates remained visible at low tide. But the bow section was different. The front half of the ship, stretching from the cutwater to the second funnel, refused to yield. It had settled firmly onto a sandbar, remaining defiantly upright and proud. It looked less like a wreck and more like a building that had been constructed in the sea. The bridge windows still reflected the sun. The forward funnel still stood tall, though its paint was peeling. The name American Star was still clearly legible on the prow, a ghostly reminder of the ambition that had brought her to this desolate coast. As the storms of winter faded and the news of the shipwreck spread, a strange phenomenon began to take hold. The wreck became a magnet. It started with the locals from the nearby villages, then the surfers who prized the powerful waves of the West Coast, and finally tourists from across Europe. They came to stand on the cliffs and stare at the impossible sight of a massive ocean liner parked on the beach. But for some, staring was not enough. The ship was tantalizingly close to the shore, separated by only a narrow channel of churning water that, at low tide, looked deceptively swimmable. The looting began almost immediately. The ship had been on her way to Thailand to become a five-star hotel, which meant she was not an empty shell. She was fully stocked. Her holds contained spare parts, massive brass fittings, and remnants of her former glory. Her saloons still held furniture. Her walls were still clad in the wood veneers of the 1940s. To the scavengers, she was a treasure chest that had cracked open, spilling her gold onto the sand. Under the cover of darkness, or sometimes brazenly in broad daylight, men swam out to the wreck or rigged dangerous zip lines from the cliffs to the deck. They boarded the ghost ship, their boots crunching on the broken glass and debris. They moved through the tilted corridors with flashlights, stripping the American Star of her dignity piece by piece. Anything that could be unscrewed, pried loose, or carried was taken. Heavy brass portholes, blackened by 50 years of salt air, were wrenched from the hull. The teak handrails were sawed off. The lighting fixtures, the bathroom fittings, even the heavy bronze steam whistles from the funnels were hauled away to be sold in local markets or kept as macabre souvenirs. For those who dared to enter the wreck during those early years, the experience was hallucinatory. To walk inside the American Star was to step into a disorienting world where gravity and architecture were at war. The ship had a list to port, meaning the floors were sloped at a dizzying angle. Explorers had to walk with 1 foot on the floor and 1 on the wall, navigating staircases that now led into dark pools of seawater. The main lounge, once the scene of elegant balls and cocktail parties, was a cavern of decay. The high ceiling was still intact, but the floor was covered in a thick layer of sludge and rot. The sunlight streamed in through the shattered windows, illuminating the peeling paint and the rusted steel beams. The silence of the abandoned spaces was constantly broken by the booming echo of the waves hitting the hull, a rhythmic reminder that the ocean was still attacking the foundations. In the lower decks, the sound was terrifying, a deep, resonant groan of metal grinding against rock that vibrated through the soles of the intruder's feet. It was a dangerous playground. The wreck was unstable, filled with jagged metal, open elevator shafts, and compartments flooded with oil-slicked water. The Atlantic currents swirled around the hull with lethal force, creating undertows that could drag a strong swimmer out to sea in seconds. Over the years, dozens of people would be injured, and several would lose their lives trying to conquer the ghost ship. Yet the allure was irresistible. There was something deeply primal about climbing aboard a dead Leviathan, a feeling of conquering a monster. By the late 1990s, the American Star had been picked clean. She was a skeleton. The interiors were stripped to the bare metal. The wooden decks had rotted away or been burned in bonfires lit by squatters who occasionally spent the night on board. The majestic forward funnel, rusted through at the base, finally collapsed in a winter storm, crashing onto the deck and leaving the ship looking decapitated. Yet even in this ruined state, she possessed a haunting nobility. She became a landmark, a permanent fixture of the Fuerteventura coastline. Photographers flocked to capture her decaying silhouette against the blazing sunsets of the Canary Islands. She appeared on postcards and in travel guides. She had failed to become a hotel in Thailand, but in a twisted irony, she had become a tourist attraction anyway. She was the ghost ship of the Canaries, a symbol of endurance and decay. The ocean, however, is patient. It does not forgive, and it does not forget. While the bow section stood firm for years, giving the illusion of permanence, the relentless chemistry of salt water and oxygen was eating the steel from the inside out. The hull plates were thinning. The rivets were dissolving. The massive steel girders that formed the ship's spine were turning to flakes of orange rust. Every wave that struck the ship took a tiny payment, washing away a few more ounces of iron. The American Star was fighting a war of attrition she could not win. She was shrinking, settling deeper into the sand, bowing her head toward the water that would eventually claim her. But before she disappeared completely, she had one final role to play. She would serve as a grim warning about the power of nature and the fragility of human engineering. As the new millennium dawned, the wreck began to list more severely. The angle became steeper. The ocean was preparing to finish what the tow line had started, ready to drag the last remains of the American Queen down into the surf, erasing her from the skyline, but burning her image forever into the memory of anyone who saw her standing defiant in the waves. By the turn of the millennium, the SS American Star had ceased to be a ship in any functional sense and had become a geological feature of the Fuerteventura coastline, a man-made promontory of rusting steel fighting a losing war against the relentless chemistry of the Atlantic Ocean. The majestic white hull that had once gleamed under the lights of New York Harbor was now a canvas of decay, streaked with long vertical scars of orange rust that looked like open wounds bleeding into the sea. The salt spray, driven by the ceaseless trade winds, had coated every inch of the vessel in a corrosive crust that ate through iron with the appetite of a living thing, dissolving the rivets that held the great liner together and turning solid steel girders into brittle flakes that crumbled at the touch. The wreck had become a grim hourglass for the locals and the tourists who continued to flock to the cliffs of Playa de Garcey. They weren't watching a static monument anymore. They were witnessing a slow-motion collapse that was measured not in seconds, but in seasons. Every winter storm that battered the coast took a visible toll, stripping away another layer of the ship's identity. The teak decks, once scrubbed wholly by generations of sailors, had long since rotted away or been scoured off by the waves, leaving the steel skeleton of the superstructure exposed like the ribs of a decomposing whale. The forward funnel, which for years had stood as a defiant exclamation point against the sky, finally succumbed to gravity and corrosion. toppling onto the deck in a tangled mass of metal that signaled the end of the ship's recognizable silhouette. In the early 2000s, the list to port became more pronounced, shifting the center of gravity and accelerating the destruction. The ship was no longer sitting flat on the sandbar. She was slowly rolling over, preparing to surrender to the ocean floor. The port side of the hull, submerged in the churning surf, was taking the brunt of the Atlantic's energy, and the constant hydraulic hammering was weakening the structural frames that supported the massive weight of the upper decks. The noise coming from the wreck shifted from the hollow, booming echoes of the empty hull to the screeching, high-pitched groans of metal being twisted beyond its yield point, a sound that carried over the roar of the surf and unsettled anyone standing on the beach. The tipping point arrived in November 2005, when the Atlantic finally broke the ship's back for the second time. The port-side hull plating, thinned to the consistency of paper by a decade of corrosion, collapsed under the weight of the superstructure. In a series of violent, shuddering movements that occurred over several days, the bow section of the American Star rolled almost completely onto her side. The bridge, where the captain had once stood to navigate through typhoons and war zones, was smashed into the water. The starboard side, now facing the sky, became a rusted cliff face, and the once proud prow, still bearing the faint outline of her name, dipped lower as if bowing in final defeat. From the shore, the transformation was shocking. The wreck no longer looked like an ocean liner. She looked like abstract art, a jagged, incomprehensible shape of metal protruding from the waves. The romance of the ghost ship began to fade, replaced by the stark reality of a garbage heap sliding into the sea. The looters stopped coming because there was nothing left to steal and nowhere left to walk. The corridors were vertical shafts, the staircases led to nowhere, and the interior was a death trap of shifting debris and surging water. The American Star had become hostile, a jagged reef of iron that threatened to tear apart anyone foolish enough to approach her. By 2006, the wreck began to accelerate its disappearance, slipping deeper into the sand as the current scoured the seabed out from under her. The ocean was digesting the ship. At high tide, waves would wash completely over the remains, obscuring the wreck in a cloud of light foam. And when the water receded, less of the ship would be visible than the day before. The famous ghost ship photos that had circulated on the internet showing a towering, majestic wreck were now historical documents, capturing a moment that was gone forever. The reality on the beach was a jagged shark fin of rust that broke the surface only to mark the grave of what lay beneath. In March 2007, the final act of the visible drama played out. A severe storm system moved through the Canary Islands, whipping the ocean into a frenzy that matched the gale of 1994. Waves pounded the remains of the hull with relentless fury, tearing apart the last connections that held the steel plating together. When the storm cleared and the locals returned to the cliffs, the American Star was effectively gone. The massive bow section, which had stood guard over the beach for 13 years, had collapsed completely into the surf. Only a few jagged spikes of metal remained above the waterline, looking like the blackened teeth of a submerged monster, appearing and disappearing with the swell. The ocean had won. It had taken a vessel built of 20,000 tons of Pennsylvania steel, a vessel that had survived the kamikazes of the Pacific and the U-boats of the Atlantic, and ground it down into nothing more than iron oxide and sand. The disappearance was so total that visitors arriving at Playa de Garcey in 2008 often looked at the empty ocean and asked, "Where is the ship?" They couldn't believe that something so huge could simply vanish, leaving behind no trace other than the stain of rust in the water and the debris scattered along the shoreline. But the American Star was not entirely gone. She had simply moved to a new domain. She now lies just beneath the surface, a treacherous artificial reef that is invisible from the shore but deadly to mariners. The remains of the hull are scattered over a wide area of the sea floor, a labyrinth of twisted metal and sharp edges that provide shelter for fish and a hazard for currents. The ship that was once a bridge between nations had become a hidden trap, a navigational hazard marked on charts to warn small boats to keep their distance. The long goodbye was over. The physical presence of the SS American Star had been erased from the horizon, ending one of the most spectacular and prolonged shipwrecks in maritime history. Yet, even as the waves closed over the last piece of rusting steel, the story of the ship refused to die. The images of her solitary vigil on the beach had burned themselves into the collective consciousness, creating a legend that outlived the steel. The ghost ship had finally disappeared, but she had left behind a legacy that would continue to haunt the imagination of anyone who ever looked at a photo of that lonely, broken queen standing defiant against the Atlantic, and wondered how the world could let something so beautiful simply rot away. If you were to stand on the cliffs of Playa de Garcey today, looking down at the restless Atlantic, you would see nothing but a pristine, empty coastline. The white surf rolls in from the horizon and breaks against the black volcanic sand with the same rhythmic violence it has possessed for millions of years. There is no towering steel cliff blocking the view, no rusting funnels reaching for the sky, and no jagged silhouette of a broken ocean liner to interrupt the horizon. To the uninitiated eye, it looks as though the SS American Star never existed, as if the entire 13-year saga of her slow death was nothing more than a fever dream, shared by the few who were lucky enough to witness it. However, if you walk down to the water's edge at low tide and look closely at the sand, you might find the evidence. Embedded in the beach are tiny, rusted fragments of iron, smooth as pebbles, polished by years of tumbling in the surf. These are the last physical atoms of the ship that was christened by a first lady and carried a generation to war. They are the only tangible remains of a vessel that once weighed 30,000 tons and displaced enough water to create her own tides. The ocean has completed its work, grinding the great queen down into dust and scattering her across the ocean floor in a final, absolute act of reclamation. The disappearance of the American Star is a profound reminder of the impermanence of human ambition. When William Francis Gibbs designed her in the late 1930s, he built her to conquer the ocean. He used the strongest steel and the most advanced engineering of the age to create a machine that could shrug off hurricanes and outrun submarines. She was a monument to the idea that humanity could tame the elements through industry and will. But the ocean played a long game. It didn't need to destroy the ship in a single day. It simply waited. It waited for the funding to run out, for the maintenance to stop, and for that single insignificant tow line to snap in the dark. There is a strange and bitter irony in the ship's final name. When she was the SS America, she was a workhorse, respected but often overshadowed by faster or larger rivals. But when she was renamed the American Star for her final doomed voyage, she inadvertently fulfilled that title in a way her owners never intended. In her death, she became a star. She became one of the most photographed shipwrecks in human history. Her image, that haunting profile of the bow section, standing defiant in the waves, traveled further than the ship ever did under her own power. She appeared on screensavers, in art galleries, and on the covers of books, becoming a global icon of the beauty found in decay. If the tow line had held on that stormy night in 1994, her fate would have been drastically different, and likely far more tragic in its obscurity. She would have arrived in Thailand to be gutted and turned into a floating hotel. She would have spent her final years as a static tourist attraction, likely stripped of her soul, her history plastered over with drywall and neon lights. Eventually, when the business failed or the hull became too expensive to maintain, she would have been quietly towed to a scrapyard in India or Bangladesh and cut apart by anonymous workers who knew nothing of her glory days. She would have disappeared in silence, forgotten by the world. By running aground, the American Star chose her own ending. She refused the ignominy of the scrapyard and the humiliation of the hotel conversion. Instead, she died on her feet, facing the open Atlantic, fighting the waves until the very end. It was a violent, messy, and agonizing death, but it was a death that commanded attention. It forced the world to stop and look at her one last time. It forced us to see the elegance of her lines and the strength of her construction as the ocean slowly peeled back her skin. In her destruction, she achieved a kind of immortality that the United States or the Queen Mary, preserved in museums, can never quite touch. She became a legend because we watched her die. The story of the American Star is ultimately a story about the fragility of the connections that bind our world together. We build massive systems, steel hulls, and grand plans, but often everything hangs by a single thread. A microscopic crack in a weld can split a tanker. A single tow line snapping in a gale can doom an ocean liner. We like to believe that our engineering makes us masters of the planet, but the ocean is always there to correct us. It is the great leveler, the patient eraser that eventually scrubs away our mistakes and our monuments alike. Today, the energy of the American Star has shifted from the physical world to the digital one. She exists in the archives of the Internet and in the memories of those who stood on the cliffs of Fuerteventura and felt the ground shake as the waves hit her hull. She serves as a memento mori for the industrial age, a reminder that steel is temporary, rust is inevitable, and that no matter how big the ship, the sea always wins in the end. The Queen is gone, but the waves that roll over her grave are still singing her song, crashing against the shore with the same relentless power that broke her back, waiting patiently for the next ship to lose its way in the dark.